On behalf of the Council on Economic Policies, I wish you all welcome to this webinar, which is on recent trends in trade policy and services trade policies. And one of the really good sources of information on trends in services trade policies is the OECD STRI. And here to tell us all about it is Janos Ferencz. And my name is Hildegunn Kyvik Nordås, and I will moderate the discussion. And with us, we also have 3 panelists, which are Biswajit Nag. He's a professor and the head of the economics department at the Indian Institute of Foreign Trade. And then we have Ben Shepard, who is the principal and founder of Developing Trade Consultants. And then we have Quan Zhao, who is a trade policy advisor at the International Trade Center. And all of them have worked extensively on services and services trade policies for a long period of time. So before we start, just a few housekeeping issues. So this is being recorded, and after the meeting, it's going to be posted at the CEP website and also YouTube. And the audience is welcome to ask questions in the chat, and I will try to bring as many as possible to the panelists. And if you want to have a discussion in the chat, you are welcome to do so as well. So without further ado, I give the floor to Janos, and we are looking forward to your presentation.
Introduction, and I would like to extend my thanks also to the Council on Economic Policies for organizing this event and for inviting me to speak about our flagship product on the OECD Services Trade Restrictiveness Index. My name is Janos Ferencz. I'm a trade policy analyst at the OECD's Trade and Services Division, and I would like to provide a few insights that emerge from this year's work that we have undertaken on the STRI. And I have a few very brief slides to show. I will try to put them on the screen. I hope you can see the presentation. Thank you. So I would like to cover 3 key ideas or key topics. Firstly, I would like to speak a bit about the process of the annual update of the OECD STRI, just to give a sense about how we do the data collection, what information we look for, and how what is the process that we undertake to have this information every year. In the second, I would like to provide a brief overview of the key findings and messages that come out of the latest release, which was done at the beginning of this month. So at the 1st of February, we launched the STRI for 2021. And lastly, I would like to speak a little bit about the recent OECD findings in terms of the impact of services liberalization and potential for going forward in terms of the STRI update. So starting a little bit about the process, the OECD has a long-standing work on measuring the regulatory environment for services, and this is done through the OECD Services Trade Restrictiveness Index. And I believe many of the participants might have heard about this tool before, but just for those for whom it's something new, this is a measurement tool that comprises of a regulatory database that collects information on the applied services barriers and quantifies these into an index that ranges between 0 and 1, where 1 is a depiction of a completely restricted regulatory environment. And one of the key advantages of this project is that we provide an annual update in which we collect information on recent policy changes that affect 22 different services sectors across 50 countries. And the reason for doing this is to generate and maintain a global evidence base on services trade policies with the view to provide the latest evidence to policymakers, researchers, businesses on the status of services trade regulations. And this has proven a very exciting exercise, because every year we find something new to report on, something that countries have undertaken. And there's also, as we increase gradually the country coverage of the STRI, we learn more about the regulatory environment in different parts of the globe. In terms of the process, we start the year by looking at what important policy changes have countries adopted in the previous year. So as I mentioned, we just launched at the beginning of this month the latest 2021 OECD STRI, and we are already in the process of starting the data collection for the 2022 STRI for this year. And this is actually the most time-consuming part of the update, where we go about and collect information from countries on their applied regulations, with the view to understanding what changes they implement, either through new regulations, amendments to their regulations, or any other policies that affect services trade. There is also a verification process involved, in which we share the information and evidence that we collected with the countries themselves. And this is a very important quality component of the exercise, in which we want to ensure that the information that we collected is indeed accurate and relevant, and we confirm this with the relevant countries. And towards the end of every year, we generate the new indices, summary findings for every country and every sector, and we update the existing online tools that provide users with the broader access to this information. So in a nutshell, that's the process that we undertake every year. And at the beginning of every year, we provide the summary report. So the one that we launched this month, you can see it here on the right side, a snapshot of the cover page. And if you're interested, the link below can lead you to the full study. So my presentation will try to highlight some of the key messages that come through the latest STRI update. And perhaps starting with the most important right away is that compared to last year's, in which we have seen a gradual increase in the volume of services trade barriers, last year we saw that actually services trade has liberalized across almost all sectors. And here you see the cumulative changes that we collect in the STRI for all 22 sectors, and those are shown by the bars. And you also see the dots that signify how the same image looked like last year. And you see the orange dots that depict the situation for 2020. You see that compared to that year, we see a significant amount of decrease in the new barriers that have been adopted last year. We can also dive a bit deeper into these findings and look a bit at the different mode of supply. So for those of you working on services, this is a very familiar term, but for those who do not necessarily work in this field, a mode of supply means the different channels through which services can be traded. So the most common channel would be, for instance, mode 3, which is through commercial establishment, or mode 1, which is cross-border trade, and mode 4, which would be the supply of services through the temporary movement of people. And through the STRI, we see quite a lot of movement, and the broad scope of liberalization this year has been centered around mode 3 and mode 4 changes. But at the same time, we also get a sense of where tightening or trade restrictive measures might have still remained in place, and that's also a bit focused on mode 3. So that's an interesting insight where we see a lot of dynamics going in both directions. And I think it's also important to flag the mode 4 liberalization, which in large part comes after the more restrictive environment that has been imposed at the beginning of the COVID crisis in 2020 and we saw a lot of liberalizations, particularly on visa processes, during the time that we looked at the data collection last year. Having information for 50 countries also allows us to have a sense as to which countries perform more, or what are the scope of liberalization for countries. On this slide, you see the top reformers, or the countries with the most trade liberalizations in 2021, as well as during the entire period of data coverage, which would be from 2014 to 2021. And if we look at last year, we see that the United Kingdom was one of the, well, it was the most, the country that has introduced the most liberalizing reforms, followed by Indonesia and Vietnam. And I will speak a little bit more about the UK because that's a very interesting case this year. But if we look at the right side, and if we look at the broader period between 2014 and 2021, we see that countries such as China or Kazakhstan were among the key reformers. And that's particularly because these countries tend to start at a very high level of services trade restrictiveness, but through gradual reforms that they implement over the years, they accumulate these opening ups over time, that in this case shows that they have opened up quite significantly. Looking a bit closer to the UK, it's quite interesting because, of course, the UK left the European Union and the transition period ended in December. So starting of January 2021, there has been an overwhelming amount of new regulation that came through the United Kingdom. And a lot of it has been changed as a result of the UK leaving the EU. And here you see the implications on the STRI indicators, where across all sectors, there has been some degree of opening up, most notably in some of the sectors that relate to transport, so air transport or maritime transport, but to more moderate degree across all sectors. However, I think it's important to put that a bit into perspective, because as the UK leaves the EU, they leave behind a regulatory environment that was much more open within the EU. So here, for instance, we also look at the regulatory environment within the EU and the EEA, where we find that there's substantially less barriers to services trade within the EU. So the UK is leaving this environment and moves a bit more closer to what applies on a most favored nation basis. So it is true that the UK has opened up, but maybe it is leaving an environment that was much more liberal before. We also have worked quite a bit last year on adding new countries to our Digital Services Trade Restrictiveness Index, or Digital STRI, which provides us with a new way and a more expanded way to look at the relevant barriers that affect digitally enabled services across different regions. And here what you see is a depiction of what we find for different parts of the globe. I think it's particularly interesting to highlight that some of the regions, notably Africa, shows a significant decrease over time in the terms of barriers that affect digital trade. The STRI is also one of the tools that that we try to promote for policymakers also outside of the OECD. We work together with ASEAN and APAC to promote the use of the STRI in these regional fora. And there is currently active work going on to develop similar tools on measuring the regulatory environment in both of these fora. I think many of the participants will also be familiar with the WTO's recent work on services domestic regulations and the reference paper that was concluded in December last year. And this marked again something that was a very important moment for services trade last year. And it actually resonates well with the STRI findings in terms of momentum for liberalizing services across different countries, but also on a more multilateral dimension. And this is important because the OECD STRI can also be used to assess the impact of potential reforms, such as the one that we saw on services domestic regulations. And in fact, we contributed to providing estimations about the potential of having a full implementation of these new WTO disciplines. And then we estimated that the gains coming from this services domestic regulatory framework would amount to up to $100 billion annually. So this is to show not only the value of having more robust commitments on services, but also the value of the STRI to support the discussions of policymakers and to help to give concrete evidence on the potential gains that these kind of policies can achieve for the economies. And I would like to conclude by a few thoughts on where do we go from here. The STRI is a tool that we will continue to update and expand. And currently there is work underway to expand the sectoral coverage, notably to environmental services, asset management services, and other business services. And we also continue our regional engagements with APAC, ASEAN, and bilateral engagements with other interested economies. There's also an important point in terms of keeping the STRI relevant for policy discussions. So for us, it's very important to make sure that the framework and the relevance of this tool is something that stays evergreen. And I think discussions like the one that we have today are particularly relevant to understand where we might want to fine-tune or change the methodology in going forward to make sure that the STRI stays relevant. There's also ongoing work to develop a broader set of tools to make it easier for users, academics, and policy makers to use the STRI information, and in the same way to also expand the analytical application of the STRI. I'm going to stop there. I hope that provides a brief overview of the process, the key findings, and the impact, and I hope that serves as a good basis for the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Very interesting presentation and very interesting topics. And some of the interesting takeaways from this is really during the pandemic, we see that that restrictions on mode 4 has been eased quite substantially. That's a bit of a paradox, maybe, that policy restrictions on movement of people is being eased when nobody can move. But we can discuss that as we go forward. And I also found it very interesting to look at the UK, who kind of claimed when they left the European Union that they would be a champion of free trade globally. And there seems to have been at least some development in that direction. So thank you so much. So I think we go in alphabetical order with the discussants and comments. So we'll start with Biswajit. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Hildegunn. And Janos, thanks for this wonderful presentation. It's very clear and also very interesting as well. And I start with what Hildegunn said that, the most surprising thing about mode 4 liberalization. Okay. As we have experienced that during the pandemic, the world is moving towards more services, or most of the things will be delivered through some mode of digitalization or some kind of thing. So, so that part is well understood, that most of the countries will be taking up liberalization in services, right? And another thing which I found quite interesting is the balance in mode 3. right? So in one hand, the countries are opening up, but at the same time, maybe some kind of restrictions they will be bringing up. So throughout the world, we have a sense of protectionism was still there, right? So it has not gone. So maybe that's the dilemma the policymakers are having, to invite more foreign investment at the same time to put certain restrictions so that the domestic players are also get some kind of a space. Another interesting stuff, what I got that the developing countries, as I mentioned, the Indonesia, Vietnam, Kazakhstan, okay? So these countries are speeding up. So that's a good sign that, that every country understood that the service trade liberalization is very important. That's the future, because the world is more connected. And in a connected world, the services will move very fast. So in all modes, actually, we'll be seeing a more kind of a integration. Another important observation which I had about Africa. So we found that, African countries are also catching up, as they're also experiencing service trade liberalization. And OECD's interactions with ASEAN, APEC, and WTO is definitely important. And WTO's work on domestic regulation is definitely getting, huge cooperations from OECD, as I can understand from your talk. That is also very, very important. So towards the analytical part, I have few observations because I have been working on STRI data set and also teaching the methodology to our students. I think that's the place, actually a space where actually some improvement can be done. You have already mentioned about methodological improvement, because it's a qualitative information. So the most interesting thing that how actually you are converting qualitative information into a quantitative data. It's mostly in the binary form. And that particular thing is not only important for making STRI, but it is also important for many other subjects as a whole. So we can actually take that as an interesting way of looking at qualitative information and converting it to quantitative part. In some cases, the index depends on the expert opinion. So in some cases, perhaps this expert opinion can be expanded further. It is good that many cases actually, as you have mentioned, that you are getting back to the country, verifying the information. That's the information, but when the information goes into the methodology, and then the most important part is how actually you are rating that information in the 0 to 1 scale. Okay, so you have set methodology, and sometimes that set methodology may be looked into, and maybe there is a scope to improve that particular part. Having said that, what I found is the paradox, as Hildegunn also mentioned about mode 4. I think that's an interesting area to discuss further. We know that people are not able to move. So even if we liberalize, people won't be able to move much. And there may be less restriction, but as the world is now moving towards more digital space, so the need for movement will also come down significantly, right? And I think you need to see from that context that whether people will really move because as far as I know, in India, most of the IT companies, in fact, I can see there is an IT boom in India this moment. The IT boom in the sense that, they are recruiting like anything. Average salary has gone up significantly, but people are not traveling, right? So they are working from home, and perhaps in many cases they will work from home. In many parts of Bangalore or Gurgaon, the office space is empty, but business is flourishing. So even if you really make the mode for more liberalized, the need for travel might go down, and that might serve the same purpose. And what I get, that's possibly one of the most important, insights which I get from these things, and I can relate this thing what is happening here. I think let me finish here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for interesting comments, and also relating to the methodology of the STRI itself, and some recent trends. Really interesting comment, this one on the digitization and the relationship between mode 1 and mode 4. I think that is something to be discussed as we continue this discussion and beyond. So I now give the floor to Ben, who will comment also.
Okay, thanks Hildegunn for the invitation, and thanks also Janos for the great presentation. I've really only got two things to say. The first one is probably to echo, I think, what many of us in the room are thinking, which is that in terms of a global transparency initiative, I think the STRI is either best practice or very close to it. So we now have this incredible wealth of information on services trade. As someone who's been working on it now for 15 years or so, the information base that we have now, it's just a completely different world from what we started with. And I think the OECD has really been driving that process. And so for those of us working outside the international organizations, we're incredibly grateful that you put all of this into the public domain, you let us download it. It really is a great exercise in transparency. So that's the first point. Then the second point is that I wanted to pick up on something that Janos had on his very last slide, which is about expanding the analytical applications of the STRI. And indeed, I think that's a key point. Let me give you a couple of examples of areas in which I think we, meaning the trade policy community, not just OECD, but all of us, could do a bit more to actually exploit these data. So, to my mind, what we have at the moment is this enormous database. Given the quantity of information that we have, I think in the research community, it actually remains a little bit underexploited. So let me talk about a couple of areas where I think I'd like to see some more work. One is in something that Janos touched on, and I think Biswajit was touching on it as well, which is quantification of the measures. I always get a little nervous when I see a chart, and the STRI is not unique in this, the Global Trade Alert does it as well, where we simply tally up restricting measures and liberalizing measures. In fact, we don't know anything about the economic consequences in a net sense just from tallying up the number of measures, because we need to relate it to some kind of economic variable, whether it's trade flows, GDP, welfare, prices, something else. So I think this issue of quantifying policies, it's an area where OECD has already done some important work in terms of converting the STRIs into ad valorem equivalents. And so the question that I have is whether when we report these findings and when we do the year-on-year updates, should we have, every time we do it, kind of two charts, one saying this is what the pattern of legal changes looks like, and then the other one saying this is what the pattern of economic changes looks like, because we know that those two things do not have a simple and straightforward relationship. It's true in many areas of economics. I think it's particularly true in services trade. So I think that's one area that I'd like to see the research community a lot more engaged in. Then the second area that I'd like to talk about is this issue, and again, this was mentioned in the presentation, looking at what in tariffs we call the effectively applied rate of protection. So the STRI has this huge database of most favoured nation measures. It then has a selected range of effectively applied rates of protection within the European Union, the EEA. But I think broadening that out to look at the impact of other trade agreements is really a crucial thing to do. And again, I know there's work ongoing in this area, but I think to double down on that, because of course, services trade is part of just about every trade agreement these days. And I know from the work that I do, both for governments and also sometimes for the private sector, there are huge questions out there about what the agreements are actually doing. And I think, you know, Janos was right to kind of highlight this question about the UK. So, you know, the UK is a really interesting example of that. On the one hand, we see some liberalisation of MFN policies, but we see a huge restriction of preferential policies vis-a-vis the European Union. What's the net economic effect? Okay, that's where we need to go back to the first point and kind of quantify that. And I think we have the tools out there in the literature to help us do that. So there's a lot of literature from tariffs and non-tariff measures on the optimal aggregation of trade policy measures. And I think we're getting to the point now where we can think about doing that in services trade, which again is a huge step forward. So then the final point that I wanted to make, talking again about quantification, is kind of going in a slightly different direction. In particular, when I deal with the private sector, they always say, you know, it's great to have something like the STRI that tells us about the overall policy environment in our sector. But what we really care about is the particular measures that go into it. So I think a great strength of the STRI from a data collection and analysis standpoint is that it covers so much data. I think Janos mentioned over 1,900 policy measures going into each country's set of STRI scores. But of course, when you're a business, there may only be 3 or 4 of those policy measures that you really care about. And I think from an economic standpoint as well, we need to know more about which of these measures is really driving the impacts that we see on trade. Is it a complex interaction among a huge range of policies that's driving it? Or is it really just a few key things? It's interesting from a quantification perspective. I think it's vital from a policy perspective when we're thinking about reforming policies. Do we need to do this in a kind of broad-based, big push framework, or can we move forward very selectively on a few key pieces? So I think that's one area, again, where the research community could get more involved and help, I think, mobilize some technology to try and help us solve this really very difficult problem of how do we relate, you know, 1,900 policy measure observations to a much smaller number of economic variables. And I think there's some interesting literature out there using machine learning and other sorts of techniques that are well suited to this kind of feature reduction. And I think it comes back actually to the point that Biswajit made in his comments about the weights that go into the index. So OECD, again, has been perfectly transparent about where those weights come from. But I just wonder now whether we can actually improve on that process that was gone through, you know, about a decade ago now, over a decade of coming up with the different sets of weights. So all of that to say that I think the tools that are available on the website are really a fantastic step forward, particularly for policy researchers. My only request is that as a data guy, if you want to mobilize the research community, rather than having simulators and tools and automatic graphs and all this kind of stuff, we just love plain old boring CSV files that you can download with the whole thing flattened and sort of set up without any extra to do. So not suggesting that you take anything away. What's there is fantastic. Just a link on the side to download the whole thing, which is already available on the website anyway. But as I say, thanks very much for sharing the update, and I really got a lot out of it, as I'm sure everyone else did too. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. That's fascinating aspects also. So on the one hand, we have this huge database, and then on the other, what can we do with it to make the best use of it? And as you mentioned, it's probably easier now than it was, say, 8 years ago when they started with all the new tools that we've got in machine learning and actually analyzing text and maybe better tool to pick out the few among the 1,900 that would really have an impact. So yeah, think that's really interesting comments. So now we move to the last panelist, which is Quan Zhao. So the floor is yours, or the mic is yours.
Thank you very much, Hildegunn, for the invitation, and thanks to Janos for a great presentation on the latest update to the STRI tool. Personally, I came across STRI actually, I think, quite early. Was back in the days when I was still working in the Ministry of Commerce, serving as a trade negotiator. And we were invited to Paris by OECD to do an introduction about the STRI. I think it was probably still in the early days when STRI was developed and already trying to reach out to the non-OECD members, as Janos mentioned, that this is still a continuous effort to try to expand it and to include more countries. So we're given an introduction about the methodologies and the structure and the data set. And obviously the first question that we asked was, I think, as mentioned by Biswajit and Ben, is that how do you turn something qualitative into quantitative, and are the weights and indexes set by the experts, how to what extent they can reflect the kind of different at the actual weight, and that was, I think, probably the most important question that needs to be answered. But obviously, the data set was wonderful, because at that time, as trade negotiators, we had no idea about where to find, actual data, actual applied regimes on services trade. GATS commitments are outdated. There's a lot of water in between, commitments and what is actually applied. And in negotiations, you can't possibly go to consulting firms or other sources to find actually applied rules. So it was a very useful tool. Even at the time, we did not jump right on board of being part of it, but we did use it quite extensively for analysis and trade negotiations. And great to see that it's been constantly updated, and also that provides kind of monitoring also of the developments in the services trade. So after that, I left my previous work as a trade negotiator and joined International Trade Center, which is a joint agency of the UN and the WTO. Mainly focused on providing technical assistance to developing countries to help them to better trade. And services trade is one of the areas that we're receiving increasing number of requests for technical assistance. And STRI continues to prove to be a very important and useful tool in the work that we do here at ITC on services trade. More recently, for example, in one of our projects in Central European countries for assisting CEFTA, Central Europe Free Trade Agreement, CEFTA members with implementation of their CEFTA services trade commitments. Actually, the first thing that we did is to map the gaps, basically taking the STRI database and to look at their CEFTA parties' commitments and to see, in which areas they have implemented and in which areas actually there's no implementation. So STRI is always useful for this kind of work as the first step to map out the regulations and to assess the gaps before going into more detailed consultations with specific sectors. And also, we certainly use it, we continue to use it to advise the developing countries on trade policies and trade negotiations, helping to pinpoint and formulate the negotiation positions, and also is a great tool for driving domestic policy reforms, to know what other countries are doing in this specific sector, how are they regulated, to have a very broad picture of what's happening globally in specific sectors. So that's also a very useful area. And also we use it for market intelligence for MSMEs. Sometimes we get requests about specific regulations on services trade in their export market, and we try to locate those in the regulations, and that's where we also turn to STRI for information. So all of these are, just sharing some of the ways that we're using STRI, and it's great to see that it's been constantly updated, and I'm also particularly interested in this digital STRI that you have mentioned. And as Biswajit and Ben said, that we're in an accelerated digital transformation. Many more services are going to be traded through Mode 1 or online. So how to have an index, or to have a methodology to capture those policy developments in the digital area will be very important. There are also competitors out there in the market. So I think, but given the history of STRI and the data that you have accumulated over the years and the experiences, I'm sure that on digital you'll have a very good methodology and a continued line of data collection and analysis. So, and also I'm very happy to see from your presentation that developing countries, in particular China, has been seen as the one of the reformers by reducing the largest margins of trade restrictions. So I'm sure that my former colleagues in Beijing will be very happy to learn about that. You also mentioned that many of the developing countries have started with a higher base, so there's still a lot of room to further improve and remove the services trade barriers. And I think that was also interesting to see that that Mode 4 was more has seen more reductions of restrictions during the pandemic. I'm not sure whether it's related to the demand, increased demand for the temporary movement of workers because of the pandemic, or because of this trend that I think the pandemic has changed a lot. A lot of its impact is going to stay, like remote work, like we see also in some countries that people are quitting their jobs more frequently. So that also kind of changed the mentality about the work and life balance. So I think maybe to some extent that can also be related to how services trade is going to evolve in the coming years. Yeah, that's about it. So looking forward to the questions and comments.
Thank you so much. Again, very useful intervention on how the STRI is being used, and it's always good to hear that people find it useful. So Janos, would you like to respond to some of these comments?
Yes, with great pleasure. Thank you, Hildegunn. And first of all, I would like to thank the panelists for the very constructive interventions and all the great ideas. I think this is one of the benefits that I see in the STRI, that there is always room to extract more information and different kind of information out of the database. So indeed, Ben mentioned that we have about 1,900 measures per country, but now we have 50 countries, and then we have over 100,000 measures overall. So there's a lot of scope to extract different information that is relevant for policymakers. And indeed, with the advance of new technologies, we can maybe extract a bit more and different kind of information than we're able to do a couple of years ago. We are, of course, always trying to be on the forefront of these new developments and also involving new techniques to try to extract more out of it. But I find it very, very useful to always engage with the users of the STRI to learn more about how we can tailor this product in a way that that best meets the needs of the academia, of researchers, but also policymakers. So that is to say that I'm very grateful for all the feedback. I go back with a lot of interesting ideas that will help us to already now, when we start thinking about the 2022 update, to think about how we can further improve the usability of this tool. I just tried to maybe also answer a couple of specific points. So notably, maybe to start with the mode 4 paradox, which I think is a very good way to coin it. So of course, we were a bit surprised by that ourselves. And we looked a bit into which countries have changed what. And it turns out that many countries have had very tight conditions during the first year of the pandemic on conditions such as visas, particularly business visas, which in 2021 in many cases were deregulated or more opening ups took place. So that conditioned a bit the index level, and particularly for some of the essential transport personnel or people who are really in need of easing the conditions when it comes to borders and visas. So those were the ones that particularly showed up in a couple of countries. And in other countries, there have been an overhaul of the conditions that relate to temporary movement of professionals. And that was the case, for instance, in the UK, where they have completely changed the regulatory framework that applies to intracorporate transferees, contractual and independent services suppliers, which in the past was a bit conditioned also in line with the EU policy. But after Brexit, there was room to revamp and lower the conditions that apply to these professionals. But that is to say that what we see in the STRI is a change that countries apply in their policies and regulations. It's not necessarily an indication of the actual flow of people over borders. So of course, we know that people cannot travel, and the STRI is not meant to depict the actual flow of people over borders. It shows what countries put in place in their policies and regulations. I think also a bit the balance on the mode 4, I think that was interesting for us as well. So on the one hand, we saw many countries easing the conditions that relate to setting up businesses. For instance, there were a couple of countries that removed conditions for setting up insurance branches that previously used to be regulated or not possible at all. But at the other side, the more tightening changes were related very much to conditions related to screening of foreign investment. And that's not necessarily something new. That was already implemented, particularly last year in many countries, but it shows a bit more the continuation of those kind of measures also last year. I particularly value the very good ideas from Ben in terms of the analytical application and how we structure the information every year in the trends note that summarizes the update. So what we try to do there, we also look a bit at the implication of potential reforms by closing half of the gap to the best practice. And that's based on an analytical paper where we estimated the trade cost implications and trade cost equivalence. And we provide this figure there as an estimation of potential gains from including further benefits and further liberalization. But it's just perhaps an area where we need to think more about how we can make it a bit more concrete for policymakers to get a better sense of the value and the gains from liberalization. And we had a very positive experience with that last year when we did this joint paper with the WTO on estimating the quantification and benefits for the SDR reference paper. So I think that kind of information could be of maybe interest. And we're also thinking and exploring how we could maybe provide some of this information more systematically on the website and embed it maybe also in some of the tools that we have. And I know, Ben, you mentioned that we shouldn't think about new tools, but I just have to say that we actually are thinking about new tools. And one of the new tools that we just developed not too long ago is called the STRI Explorer. And it allows essentially an insight to the entire database and full customization opportunity for the user, depending on what kind of information they want to see. So of course, they can see the aggregate index, a selection of indicators, compare across countries, regions. But the novelty in the Explorer is also to look at the measures and to see which measures are the ones that drive the index. So which ones are the measures that show up in most of the countries, and what is their implication on the index. So it would be possible to derive this information from this new tool when it comes to understanding what is the core set of measures that really generate or drive the index of the country. And we will try, of course, to fine-tune this further, but maybe that is already a first step in towards making this kind of information also available. So if you type in STRI Explorer, you should see this new tool, and it's still work in progress. So there could be a couple of bugs, but we're working on it. And of course, any feedback related to that would be much appreciated. Also the work on RTAs, that is a very important question that increasingly we receive also in different engagements and different fora where we work with the STRI. And we currently have work underway that looks at that specific aspect. But of course, it is something that I think we need to maybe explore a bit further. And in that context, our work with APAC, for instance, is particularly interesting because there we developed an APAC version of the STRI, which takes into account also specific APAC elements, so a bit the regional specificities and regional preferential measures like the APAC business travel card, which is only applies within APAC. So that kind of application is increasingly available, and there is actually a great demand from countries and different stakeholders for us to do more of that kind of work. And it's certainly something that we have on our plans going forward this year and next year. A bit also on the weight. So I think that's a very important component of the STRI that we always try to explain as best as we can, but it's one of the areas where also I think there's scope to maybe revisit some of the weights and to see how we can improve that. Again, I would maybe make a reference to the APAC exercise where this exact question came up. And we did a pilot exercise with APAC in 2019 and 2020. And there what we did was to relaunch a questionnaire that asked for an update of the weights. And that was a very successful exercise because not only were we able to update the existing weights in a couple of sectors, but we also managed to get a richer, more extensive basis of weights from different experts that helped us to make the overall set of applied weights more robust. So I think there's certainly interest and scope to improve also on that front, especially because we are going to continue the work with APAC, which is going to be expanded to other sectors and countries. And lastly, on the digital STRI, this is a tool that we very much value because it provides a new function to the existing STRI sectors, and it has been one of the tools that was used by different fora and in our work where we provide support for different agencies and different groups. Particularly, we value the engagement that we had with different UN economic commissions over the past years to expand the country coverage of the digital STRI. So while the standard STRI has 50 countries currently, in the digital STRI we have 74 countries, and there are plans to include more this year. And this is very, very exciting for us because it gives a bit more perspective into the regulations of developing countries. So we noted Africa particularly, but also Asian economies where we tend to maybe have less information about regulations. Those some of those would also be included in the digital STRI. So there is scope to maybe learn a bit more about those specific countries as well. I'm going to stop there, and I'm happy to maybe hear other questions from the panelists or the participants. Thank you, Hildegunn.
Any spontaneous questions or reactions from the audience or the panelists? If not, we are almost running out of time, so I think I'll try to wrap up a few points here. And so I think there are quite a few interesting questions that have come up. One of them that I really would like to discuss a bit more is why we should care about services trade restrictions. Why is it important? And what does it mean for consumers and businesses? And so that's one thing that we didn't really get into, but I think it's an important issue. And then there is also a trade-off, I think, when we think about having a long time series of an indicator like this. And it's a value by itself to have a long time series to be able to do robust econometric analysis of the impact of the STRI on trade. So you have that aspect, but then you also have what Janos just mentioned, that it's important to stay relevant and to update and to change methodology and weights and replace measures when some become obsolete. And particularly in services where we have the situation that the services are going digital more and more, and some of the measures that were included in the early 2000s may not be relevant anymore. So how to keep the STRI relevant and still keep it as a continuous indicator over time, I think that's quite a challenge going forward. And an other area where I also think there are challenges going forward, and particularly as the STRI expands into new countries, would be so the information is based on legal documents and kind of de jure regulations. And in countries where there is a close relationship between implementation and what is actually being implemented on the ground and what's in the legal documents, then it's fine. But as you move into different countries with different legal traditions, the distance between what is actually being performed on the ground and what's in the law may be bigger. So the issue here is how to kind of keep the database relevant in the sense that that business people actually recognize the restrictions that they face. That's another issue going forward. So thank you very much for your presentations and your comments and for your participation, and the best of luck going forward on future updates of the STRI. So thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.